Good morning. This week I'm going to tell you about a couple of transmission swaps that we did on a couple of, well, one was a Honda and one was an Acura. And an Acura Vigor is a weird animal, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. First Honda I ever worked on was when I was living in Port Arthur and on Lakeshore Drive. This girl brought me a Honda Civic, first one I'd ever worked on, opened the hood on, and basically the problem she was having was the air pump was just about locked up, and it was causing all kinds of problems with the belt. And in order to get to replace the belt on this thing, you see this place right here, that's the motor mount. Civics were made that way for a long time. To begin with, the motor was in there with the timing belt on the driver's side instead of the passenger side. Some engines are like that, and whenever you see one that's mounted backwards like that, it's always going to turn the way the wheels roll. So whenever you're looking at it, it's going to turn counterclockwise. If it was in there the opposite way with the timing belt over here, the engine would turn clockwise when you're looking at the timing belt. It's always turning the same way the wheels go. Anyway, this particular one, I had to take the motor mount off to get to the belt because it went around the belt, and I took the air pump off, and I took it apart, and I took the guts out of it, and it still had good bearings and stuff in it. The guts had come apart in there is what happened, and whenever I put the air pump back on there, it was basically just an idler. And those Texas didn't have emission testing and all that, so I went ahead and took care of that. But whenever I was in high school, I remember there was a girl that drove one of these kind of thing, and 3 football players could pick this thing up with her in the seat. That was just funny to me how little these cars were. Of course, there's a lot of little cars out there now too, but anyway, this Acura Vigor, this guy that I knew really well purchased this thing. It was a cream puff. I mean, it was a mom and pop car. It had never been driven very much. Had about 130 miles or 130K on the clock. And I'm gonna say this is probably car wasn't about 4, 5, 6 years old at the time when he bought it. And it drove and rode good. It felt real solid and heavy on the road. And, it was one of these. It was a fine automobile, 5-cylinder. You can see this the engine right here. So he drove it on a 200-mile trip, and all that sludge it was up in there that Mom and Pop had placed in there doing short trips melted because of the heat of the drive, and all ran down in the oil pan, slowly clogged the screen up, starved the thing for oil, and just locked the motor up about halfway back from his 200-mile trip. So he hired a shop up there to replace it with a used engine. It cost him about $2,000 to have that done in those days. And anyway, so here we go. So he drove it for a few months, and then one night without warning he was pulling away from the gas pump, and suddenly the transmission would make noise but it wouldn't pull. So he hauled it down to the school, since he was family, we went ahead and, I say that, he was my brother-in-law at the time. But I said, well, we're going to pull this thing out of here. This Acura was produced from 91 to 94 in North America and had a 2.5-liter inline 5-cylinder engine. And look at that, 176 horsepower and 170 foot-pounds of torque. That's pretty doggone strong. Had a G4A transmission in it, which was a very weird thing. We're going to talk about that Vigor a little bit. This is a front-wheel drive car, right? But the engine's in there linear. There's a lot of vehicles out there like that. Your old Cadillacs, the Eldorados were like that, and there's all these Audis. There were some 5-cylinder Audis like that, Volkswagen Quantums, this kind of thing. But this one right here had a very peculiar setup. It had a linear engine and transmission, but there was no drive shaft because it had a torque converter and all, and it had an output shaft that came right back out next to the torque converter into this final drive. And if you've ever seen one of these things, it's an oddball thing. And so you got this 5-cylinder engine, and you got these CV axles going out to these wheels, in the front, and this, you know, transmission that looks like a regular transmission, only there's nothing coming out of the back of it, you know. Well, it also had a 2002 Odyssey, and it had a harsh and delayed shift into third gear. And so these things, you know, tended to give transmission trouble anyway, and we had so much other stuff going on, and I didn't want to take a chance on some of the people I had that I weren't sure that could do that job. So I had them pull this transmission out, and we sent it to a transmission shop in the town up the road that I really liked and trusted. And there was a transmission shop locally that had a really good reputation, but all they wanted to work on was, you know, Fords and Chevys. They didn't want to work on anything that was, you know, any other make. But it's Odyssey. It's got a 3.5 liter V6, 24 valve single overhead cam, a VTEC valve train. It's an engine that produces 240 horsepower and 242 pounds of torque, which is good. This one had a 5-speed automatic in it. Alright, so this was a bear. If you ever pull a transaxle out of one of these things, if you're used to working on anything else, these Hondas, when you pull that transaxle out, there is about a zillion things connected to this H-frame. I mean, just all kinds of stuff you got to take loose from that thing. All these little lines and brackets and all that kind of stuff. It was just no fun. I put a couple of students on it, and it just about wore them out. And finally they got the transaxle out of it. Now this one here is one that I got a picture of from online, so the hoses are cut. They didn't cut the hoses, okay? So this is not an actual picture of, it's a picture of a transaxle like the one, but it's not the one. And so I just wanted to make sure of that. This is those two vehicles on the lift. We had the Acura Vigor over here. We had the, and that was pretty, they were pretty close to the same color too. I thought that was kind of interesting. One a Honda, one an Acura on the lift for transmission trouble at the same time. Sometimes we'd run into stuff like that, the fruit basket turnover. This is how the thing, that Acura looked. The engine swap was, they missed something very, very critical when they swapped out an engine. This place where the shaft comes out of the transmission, it's got a seal there, and it's supposed to be packed with a lot of grease. So you put a lot of grease in there, and believe it or not, this doggone thing has a master spline. I don't know why it has a master spline. Seems to me like they could just let you stick it in there any kind of way, but they put a master spline in there, which meant it would only fit exactly one way. Can you imagine how much fun that is? Some people might have pulled the final drive off, you know, mounted the transmission and put the final drive on there because it's not that heavy. But one way or another, we didn't do it that way. But what we found out was when we pulled it out, the reason the thing quit pulling was this guy, whoever put the motor in there, did not grease these splines. And they got wiped out over a period of time, a few months. You know, those splines got wore out and rounded out and all that. This is something that somebody that was really familiar with this particular power crane would have picked up on. We got familiar with it really quick. It's the only one of those we ever did, but there's a seal here. And let me show you here what we got. See the input, the torque converters here, the shaft, the output shaft comes right back out the front and goes into that final drive. Interesting design. I don't know if anything else has been done that way, but that's the way this one was put together. And this is the shaft that was wiped out. This was wiped out, and also the final drive was wiped out. So, and see that master spline right there? This is the one this is a replacement transmission. We had to replace the transmission because I was not going to tear the thing down and replace the shaft. You know what I'm saying? Wasn't familiar enough with that. You get in all kinds of trouble. Or it might have been easy, but I said, let's just go ahead and get a transmission put in there. As a matter of fact, as I remember, he brought a transmission with him when he brought me the car. So we went ahead and noticed there's a place right here for the seal. But you can see this was kind of rusty and had been, you know, used and abused, you know, in the splines. There's a lot of pressure on those splines. And a lot of people don't even think about that, but on an automatic transmission, if you pull heavy loads a lot, with something that's, you know, got a lighter duty transmission in it, you'll wipe the splines out on the turbine shaft in the torque converter. Just take them right out. And boy, that fills everything up with metal, and it's a big problem then. But anyway, here we are with this master spline business. We had to replace this final drive as well. It bolts to the side of the engine block, and this is what it looks like from the side. That's what it looks like looking into it. And so because of the fact that we didn't want to take a chance of this thing coming back on us, and we made sure there was plenty of grease in there when we put it back in there. Alright, now the Odyssey transmission came back from the shop. It was reinstalled. We test drove it. It didn't shift right at all. And then I got to looking and I says, wait a minute, you know, these two solenoids, one's got a brown connector, one's got a black connector, and the connectors that you plug into these are the same color as the connector they plug into. And what the transmission shop had done when they put it back together, they did everything else right, but they transposed these two solenoids. They put this one here and that one there, you know, so. And I said, well, how do we figure that out? You know, because, I mean, I knew that transmission shop was reliable enough to where they didn't typically make any mistakes on the inside of the transmission. They were really sharp. But this one here, we pull up the Honda manual. It tells you the torque converter clutch solenoid is black and the shift solenoid is brown. This is the front right here. Okay, and looking at it from the other direction, this would be in the front, the engine on that side. The shift solenoid B is there, torque converter clutch solenoid is there. See those two solenoids, and see how they got the connectors the same color as the solenoid. That's how you know which way to plug them in. Well, you put them in there backwards, they're going to be plugged in there backwards. See? So that's what typically happened there. That was a real easy fix, and it felt good to do that. We had really good success on both rides. They both rode out of there happy as a lark. Now, this is a really short video, good story, but I'll have some more stuff for you next week. And until then, have a good week and be careful out there. And we'll talk to you later.